Apollonius of Tyana has always been a little bit of a mystery to me. All I knew about him was that he came into conflict with the imperial administration at one point for supposedly performing miracles and doing magic. I remember seeing him interrogated by imperial officials in like a Stephen Saylor book, and I'd heard some really convincing arguments that Apollonius of Tyana belonged to the same category of wandering mystical polymaths and miracle workers as Jesus Christ. But as for who Apollonius truly was, what he meant to people, and what he got up to that got him in so much trouble and made him so famous, all of this was a mystery to me. Most of what we know about Apollonius of Tyana comes from a biography written by Philostratus, who was not a contemporary of Apollonius, but of Septimius Severus and his wife Julia Domna, who commissioned the piece. This is the fundamental text that you will want to look at if you want to know anything about Apollonius of Tyana. But the text is not a cold, sober retelling of the events of Apollonius's life exactly as they happened. It's an adventure story, one that takes Apollonius and his lifelong companion Damas further than even Alexander the Great had gone. It's also something of a hagiography, a larger-than-life accounting of someone whose influence and whose powers, maybe, exceed those of ordinary people. The fact that it is an adventure, and in some ways is a love letter to the extraordinary figure of Apollonius of Tyana, this will help color our understanding of the text, how we approach it, and what it can tell us about the life of this person. It is also a commentary on philosophy and its relationship to the imperial system. Once Apollonius gets on the radar of emperors, beginning with Nero, we'll see in the text how each emperor deals with Apollonius. Philostratus is himself a philosopher, and philosophers in history are not always free to go around and say whatever they want to whoever they want. These are the public intellectuals of the day, and some emperors will want to limit the influence of certain people that have, shall we say, wide platforms. And there are different reasons for that. Sometimes the ideology that certain people are going around and talking about conflicts with the narrative that the imperial administration is trying to put forward. So this poses a problem for public opinion. Anyway, philosophers tend to have lots of opinions about the role of philosophy in society, and Philostratus certainly takes the opportunity to comment on this in this work. So you can use the way that he writes about each emperor's interactions with Apollonius and with other philosophers as a guide to see whether Philostratus judges them to be a good emperor or a bad emperor. And he's not saying anything radical. Ancient Roman historians, looking back on their own history, generally tend to agree that Nero represented everything that Rome strives not to be. Nero is not widely regarded as a good emperor. Philostratus agrees with this. Generally, Vespasian is respected, everybody loves Titus, they hate Domitian. Philostratus generally aligns with these kinds of ideas. So the second half of the life of Apollonius of Tyana really gets into this question of leadership and its relationship to the forward progress of philosophy and education that people like Philostratus expected their leaders to have or at least strive towards. The text itself is entertaining and approachable. Almost certainly you're going to be reading this in English, as I did for this project. I'm not reading 300 pages in Greek at this stage in my career. It would take a year. So even if you're reading it in translation, the text is exciting, it's entertaining, it's approachable. I'll put a link in the description to the translation that I'm using for this video. It's a nice website. You can toggle between sections of each book, which I think is really helpful. What I want to do today, since I'm pretty new to this material still myself, is walk through my major takeaways after reading through the text, what I think is the most important information, some of the trends and themes and patterns that I saw popping up, and certainly to situate the text in context, so a little bit about Philostratus and Julia Domna. And if you're coming to this video after reading Philostratus, then I hope I'll be able to provide at least what I think are the most relevant and interesting tidbits that I took from this work. Which leads me to a disclaimer. This video will have spoilers, so if you don't want to know all of the fun, wild details ahead of time, then save this video for after you finish the text. And another disclaimer. Apollonius lived a life, at least according to Philostratus, a life that was full and rich. He traveled around what was in that time the known world, at least to the Romans, and he interacted with people from different walks of life and had discussions about pretty much every topic under the sun. And because of this, of course, I'm not going to be able to cover every interaction, every person that he meets, every place that he goes. Remember, this is a full life of a pretty significant historical figure. In the interest of keeping this video somewhat brief, although it will be pretty long, in the interest of keeping it as short as I can, I'm going to have to skip over some things. This is going to be the briefest of overviews. And if you find this video interesting, again, I recommend you read this text. So with that very long introduction out of the way, let's get into Philostratus's biography of the life of Apollonius of Tyana. The author of the text of the life of Apollonius of Tyana is a philosopher and a sophist called Philostratus, who lived in the 2nd and 3rd century CE in the Roman Empire. We know that he was a sophist, which at this time just meant a teacher, and that he studied philosophy as all sophists did, and that the philosophical scene that he was a part of didn't really have the same distinctions between the different philosophical schools as when these schools were just getting their start. So people will study Platonism, and they will study Stoicism, and they will study Aristotelian philosophy, and they will study cynical philosophy, and. So presumably he would have been pretty widely read in terms of the philosophers that came before him. But other than that, we don't know a whole lot about his life, unfortunately. We know that he was an Athenian, he lived and taught there, then he went to Rome, where he was teaching and socializing with the upper echelons of Roman society, and he ended up meeting Julia Domna, who is the wife of Septimius Severus, one of the emperors. And Julia Domna is the one who commissions this work. I'll have a video coming out pretty soon that goes into a little bit more detail about Julia Domna's life and her own philosophical pursuits and religious pursuits, so stick around for that. Philostratus wrote other things. He wrote the lives of the sophists. He wrote a couple of pieces called Gymnastikos and Heroikos, and we have a bunch of letters that he wrote, epistolae, and of course the life of Apollonius of Tyana. Again, at the request of Julia Domna. Luckily for us, Philostratus is very careful to tell us where he's getting his information from. There's a section at the beginning where he outlines what his sources are for this material. This is really helpful for us as we try to piece together what Philostratus is saying about Apollonius. And it's also helpful because other than Philostratus, we really don't have a lot of evidence for Apollonius of Tyana. The work exists not exactly in a vacuum, but as almost the sole testimony of this extraordinary life. So Philostratus tells us that he's using records from cities and temples that Apollonius was involved in, places he visited, maybe spent some time fixing up. One really important resource, if not the most important resource for Philostratus, is the writing of Damas, who not only features prominently in the story itself, but who also is an eyewitness to most of Apollonius of Tyana's life. So Philostratus relies very heavily on Damas's work. But he also makes reference to a historian called Maximus of Aigai, who writes a little bit about what Apollonius was up to in Aigai itself. So for that episode, he says I used Maximus. And then there's also Apollonius's own writings. Philostratus says that there's letters and that he actually got to look at Apollonius's will, which Apollonius allegedly wrote himself. And then Philostratus says that he does not use the work of Moiragenes, because Moiragenes doesn't know what he's talking about. Like I said, there's not a lot of sources that we have available to us apart from this one text by Philostratus. There are some writings attributed to Apollonius of Tyana, fragments, letters, things like that, but a lot of them are in doubt. They're attributed to Apollonius, but do they really belong to him? Did he really write them? It's unclear. So these are not great sources. In terms of a complete text or a complete source that gives us a lot of information about Apollonius, this is the only one that we have. Like I mentioned earlier, Philostratus is a philosopher, and so you might not be surprised to hear that there's a lot of philosophy in this text. Now, whether these philosophical hot takes belong to Philostratus himself or Apollonius of Tyana, I think is a good question to ask. I'm sure someone has written about this, I'm sure there are opinions about this. I don't have the answer to this right now, but it is a good question to ask. How much of this is Apollonius and how much of this is Philostratus? Philostratus definitely takes advantage of this text, and he's able to report all of these philosophical conversations that Apollonius engaged in, both with his followers and his friends, and with some of the important people that he meets on his travels. Any book like this, any lengthy writing project, especially one that is so exciting, that might appeal to children and young adults, I think is a good opportunity for a philosopher in antiquity to write a bunch of philosophy down, to convey these philosophical messages, and to promote these ideas. And this is great for us because it gives us insight into some of these ancient philosophical ideas, whether they belong to Philostratus in his own day and age, or Apollonius in his own time. Okay, from this point forward, I am going to be working within the context of the story. So you can assume, according to Philostratus, alongside everything that I say going forward. So, who is Apollonius of Tyana? We get a good sense of his character from this story. As you might imagine, it is, after all, a biography of him. The basic story is that Apollonius of Tyana is a philosopher in the Pythagorean tradition. He follows the Pythagorean school and their way of life, and he adopts their way of thinking for his own. He was also a religious leader who took the gods very seriously and spent a lot of time in individual temples making sure that they were kept up and that the rites were being performed correctly. And he knows what the correct way is because he has some kind of special, extraordinary connection to the gods themselves, although the text does not explain why or how. But because he has this special connection, he is able to correct the rites at different temples as he visits them. There is also this mystical element to Apollonius of Tyana, and this is the most famous aspect of his personality and of his biography, is that he has this kind of mystical quality to him. which we will go through in detail as we cover this text, as we dig into Apollonius a little bit deeper. So these are the primary things about him. He is a philosopher, he is a religious leader, he is a mystic. But we also get a sense of his personality. And my first impression is that Apollonius is a little bit of a know-it-all. He seems to have all of the answers. But, this is to be expected in a text like this that is meant to praise him and is meant to show him as larger than life. And even though he's a little bit of a know-it-all, he's not really doing it for his own sake. He seems to be genuinely interested in public service, genuinely interested in improving the lives of those around him. There's a very nice anecdote about how Apollonius is able to give some good advice to his brother and help kind of get his brother back on the right path. So he seems to genuinely care. Now, he gives a lot of unsolicited advice, which is not always heeded, but whenever it is heeded in the story, it is presented as an actual improvement. So someone implements his advice and then their life gets better. Another thing that I was surprised by, I'm not sure I should have been surprised by it, but I was, is just how humorous Apollonius is. If he can deliver vital information, whether that's unsolicited advice or just something that he knows that other people are not picking up on, if he can deliver that as a joke, he will. He goes out of his way to joke around, especially with his friends and especially with Damas. His friends are really important to him. He makes friends everywhere he goes, it seems. But he's very strict. He will only be friends with people if he judges them to be of good character, meaning willing to engage in philosophy, willing to work on self-improvement, willing to consider big questions. If someone can be persuaded to change their behavior, correct their ways to what Apollonius believes is a better way of living, then he's going to be a big fan of this person. We also see that Apollonius is not just a philosopher by trade. He's really committed to living the lifestyle that his philosophy dictates. He has this ascetic quality to him, and he's not a true ascetic. He's not all about denying himself or living very, very rigidly, but he is very firm on what he does believe and how he does want to live. He follows the Pythagorean tradition. Pythagoreans were vegetarian, so Apollonius is a vegetarian. Even what we might call vegan today, because he doesn't wear clothing that was produced with animal products, whether or not it kills the animal or is just like wool or something, he won't wear it. And he also, this is kind of unusual, he will not make blood sacrifice to the gods. He's very religious and he does not want to defy the religion of the Roman Empire. He's never called impious. And yet, he won't make a blood sacrifice. He believes that the gods don't want blood sacrifice, that this is all unnecessary and is, basically everything that animal activists say about animal cruelty. So he won't participate in sacrifice, and he won't even be around sacrifice. He also doesn't drink, although he is not against wine. He just says that wine makes your brain do funny things, and so he avoids it because he's always, philosophy is about training the brain, right? So anything that would impede the brain, he is not interested in. He also does other kind of hippie wandering philosopher things like growing his hair long, walking around barefoot. And we also learn that Apollonius is entirely and completely celibate. Philostratus even goes so far as to say that Apollonius was better at controlling his passions than other philosophical leaders from the past who also were celibate and also sought to master their passions. They did pretty okay, but Apollonius did it better than anyone else. So this is how Apollonius lives, and he truly believes that his way of living is the correct way of living, and he will tell anyone that will listen, and even those who will not listen, that this is the way to live. But he doesn't necessarily want to force anyone to live the way that he lives. He will strongly suggest it, but he really is willing to let people do their own thing. So he's not going to tell the king not to sacrifice a horse, which the king wants to do, but he is going to excuse himself from the scene. He's like, okay, I'm going to go now because it's time for you to do this sacrifice and I'm not interested. But he's not telling the king not to make the sacrifice because he says, like, this is the custom of your people. There's another example of this when they're traveling in Crete, Apollonius and all of his followers, and his followers want to go and see the cave of Minos. But Apollonius has formulated this opinion about Minos. Actually, we see him formulate this opinion about Minos, and so he doesn't want to go to the cave because he doesn't want to bear witness to Minos' cruelty. But he lets his companions go, and they do, and they go and they see it. So he is willing to let people do their own thing, even if, objectively, his way is the best way. Apollonius' character is largely shaped by the people he meets and the places he goes. So I want to spend some time introducing you to the major influences on Apollonius, the people he spends time with and really learns from them, and actually we see him grow through his relationship to these people. Beginning with Damas, who is, as I keep saying, probably the most significant influence on Apollonius' life, certainly the most significant relationship that Apollonius has in his life. So Damas is from Nineveh, and Apollonius meets him there. Apollonius is traveling through town. Damas has heard of him and seeks him out to offer his services as a translator. Of course, Apollonius says, I don't need you to be my translator because I know every human language and also the secrets of silence. But he does let Damas hang around, and so Damas becomes Apollonius' first follower, who's going to stay with Apollonius for the rest of Apollonius' life. The dynamic between these two is pretty clearly uneven, which you might expect. Apollonius is the sage, and Damas is the student. Or another way to put that is that Damas is a disciple of Apollonius. Disciple coming from the Latin word discipulus, which just means student. And yeah, Apollonius corrects Damas. He sometimes makes fun of Damas. And a lot of times he'll get to go places that Damas isn't allowed to go. But, Damas isn't bothered by this necessarily. He's always willing to learn from his teacher. He diligently records their conversations and important events that happen as they go on their travels together. He even is willing to make commentary about Apollonius' growth, which is a wonderful little intimate detail. Damas says, for example, that Apollonius really enjoyed his time in India with the Indian sages and that he learned a lot from them. So you get a glimpse into Apollonius' own development in addition to Apollonius' molding of Damas' character. There's also the possibility that Damas worshipped Apollonius as a daimon. Philostratus tells us this very early on. Like I said, Philostratus relies pretty heavily on the work of Damas. And what is kind of amazing about this is that there are some scholars that think Damas didn't even exist, that Philostratus invented him as a kind of window into Apollonius' life. Philostratus is the only source that mentions Damas, but given that Philostratus is pretty much our only real source anyway, it's up for debate. But just keep that in mind as you're reading, is that none of this could be real. If Damas existed, and if Damas wrote about Apollonius, and if Philostratus used Damas for the life of Apollonius, then Damas, in the context of our understanding of what really happened, is really, really important. Like I said, this is the most significant relationship that Apollonius has. And as much as he learns from Apollonius, he is able to ground him a little bit as well. There's one point where Apollonius has received some gifts from the king, and the king calls him to an audience the next day. And Damas has to kind of tell Apollonius, hey, like, don't be rude to this king. It's probably not good if you go around and correct him this way. So Damas is able to stabilize and almost humanize Apollonius on occasion. Does that mean that Apollonius always listens to Damas's advice? No, you already know the answer. The answer is no. And one last quick note about Damas. People will be wondering if there is a romantic connection between Apollonius and Damas. And certainly in this kind of a dynamic, it would not be unheard of in antiquity for people to develop a romantic relationship. But given that Apollonius is so good at being celibate, according to Philostratus, given his dedication to philosophy and philosophy alone, I don't think there was room for Apollonius to have a romantic relationship with anybody, least of all Damas. But I do think that Apollonius and Damas were incredibly intimate. They spent years traveling together, sometimes with other people and sometimes just with themselves. They were constantly involved in deep conversations. They saw some of the most outrageous things. I mean, the wonders of the unknown world. They laughed and joked together. They corrected each other when necessary. These were essentially life partners. All they lacked was physical intimacy and what we might call romance. Another major influence on Apollonius is Fotes, the king of Taxila in what is now modern-day Pakistan. Apollonius and Fotes don't actually spend that much time together, but the brief time that they do spend together, Apollonius really likes Fotes. They get along really well, they have a lot of really good discussions, and it turns out they have a lot in common. Fotes has studied with the Indian sages, which is the whole reason why Apollonius is even visiting this part of the world. He's on his way to go to the sages. So Fotes, having already studied with them, has a wisdom that can almost give Apollonius a little teaser about what he's going to see when he gets to the sages. Fotes gives him some background information and about the state of philosophy in this part of the world anyway. The sort of things that you have to do to become a sage. How does somebody become a sage? How do the sages live? Fotes is able to give all of this information to Apollonius and to us, the readers, ahead of time. He tells Apollonius that the sages are really cool and have magic powers and they can fight bad guys with their minds. But really what draws Apollonius to Fotes is Fotes' inclination towards philosophy. They have a lot of philosophical discussions, which is what Apollonius really likes to spend his time doing. It also gives him insight into a person's character. He judges them on the basis of their participation in these discussions. And Fotes really lives up to the challenge. Apollonius gets to talk about all sorts of things with him that are maybe of a higher caliber than he's able to discuss with Damas, or at least that's how it's presented in the text. Damas is still a student of philosophy, where Fotes is, he's completed his studies with the sages, so they can go a little bit deeper. And this is something that Apollonius appreciates. And maybe most of all, Fotes asks Apollonius for advice in how to run his kingdom. He consults Apollonius. Apollonius sits in on certain audiences and weighs in on different debates that the king is supposed to decide. So the fact that Fotes wants to take Apollonius' advice immediately endears Apollonius to Fotes, because rulers are supposed to take the advice of philosophers. Another major influence on Apollonius is the head of the Indian sages himself, a man called Yarchus. Now, in terms of Apollonius's growth as a philosopher and as a student of, let's just say, arts in general, I don't want to say magic arts because Philostratus tells us Apollonius is not a magician, but in terms of Apollonius's pursuit of knowledge and his quest for wisdom, Yarchus might be the most significant influence on him. And this is not surprising. This is the major journey of Apollonius's life. He's going to travel all the way east to India to study with these sages and learn what he can from them. And he does learn a lot in his time with Iarchus and with the other sages. I mentioned already that Apollonius picks up an opinion about Minos from these guys. So Iarchus basically explains that the Indian sages believe that the underworld is all messed up because Tantalus is punished for simply wanting to provide for himself, whereas Minos is incredibly cruel during life and then is rewarded in the underworld with this place of judgment. And this really sticks with Apollonius. Like I said, later on, when they go to Crete, he won't visit the cave of the Minotaur because he doesn't want to bear witness to Minos' cruelty. This is an opinion he picks up while he's staying with the sages and learning from Iarchus. And Iarchus is also the person that Apollonius can truly have the deepest and most exciting philosophical discourse with. They can talk about not just divination, but how does divination work? What are the mechanics of it? What does a person engaging in prophecy have to do in terms of purification, in terms of lifestyle, in order to make the prophecy happen? So these are really, really deep and engaging questions that Apollonius is very happy to have. And he does grow and learn from these conversations. There are so many people that Apollonius meets and spends time with. He has other students, not just Damas. He has a group of people hanging around him at all times. People leave and join the group throughout the story. He spends some time with Demetrius, a Cynic philosopher. Demetrius actually gets in trouble and has to leave Rome, so Apollonius kind of gets a sense of what philosophy is like in the city. He's got a student, Menippus, that he has to save from a demon. More on that in just a minute. There's also Musonius, another philosopher who's actually put into prison, and then later we find out that he has been shipped off to do hard labor for one of Nero's, vanity infrastructure projects. And likewise with Philostratus, who is on his way out of the city and warns Apollonius that everything is going to hell. But Apollonius basically says that Philostratus is a coward for leaving the city, and that he's going to go into the city to show his students how dumb Nero is. So lots of philosophers that he gets into contact with. And then, of course, there's the emperors. So the biography spans essentially from Nero to Domitian. So Apollonius interacts with each of the emperors in this period. So Nero, there's mention of the year of the four emperors, but mostly it's skipped over, and then Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. Apollonius never meets Nero. We hear about Nero by reputation, and his reputation is not good. In fact, at one point they're comparing him to a wild beast. And it's all the usual stuff. Nero is fighting as a gladiator. Nero is going around forcing everybody to listen to his mixtape. Not really kidding with that. Nero is going around forcing everyone to listen to him play the lyre and sing, and everybody agrees that he's not very good, but they have to clap anyway. Nero is a parricide and he killed his mother. Nero is an anti-intellectual. Nero is banishing philosophers from Rome. All of these things come into this story and paint him as the Nero that you know and love, or that you know and hate. So yeah, Apollonius doesn't meet him, but we get a sense of his reputation, which is exactly what you would expect if you know anything about Nero. Vespasian, on the other hand, is given a very good report. Apollonius meets him. In fact, before Vespasian becomes emperor, he wants Apollonius to come and meet with him. He's fighting in Judea, but Apollonius says he's not going to go to Judea, so Vespasian actually comes to him. Yes, Apollonius has the reputation to summon future emperors to himself. You want an audience with me? Come and find me. So Vespasian is painted in a very positive light because he's willing to take Apollonius' advice on board. Likewise with Titus. Generally, Titus is very good, He doesn't rule for very long, so he doesn't really feature much in this story. And then, of course, Domitian, in terms of emperors, Apollonius's biggest adversary. Throughout his life, we see Apollonius do things that are not normal. Right away, Philostratus makes sure to tell us that Apollonius is not a magician. He makes no claim to what Philostratus calls the black art. He's not a wizard. However, he does perform certain impossible feats, and he appears to have access to supernatural channels, although this is not explored very much in the text. And this is what gets him in trouble, but this is also what makes him an enduring and exciting historical figure for us today. One of Apollonius's main superpowers, if you will, is prophecy. He is able to see things before they happen, he is able to make commentary on them, and on occasion he is able to take action in order to prevent something or to make sure that something happens later on. So just some examples of this. Early on in the story, when Apollonius and Damas are just setting off on their travels, their company comes upon a lioness who has been killed. So the crew cut her open, and they reveal that she was carrying 8 fetuses. And so Apollonius says to Damas that this means that they're going to stay a year and 8 months with the king of Babylon, which they actually do. Actually, Apollonius says that we have to start leaving 4 months early because he also knows ahead of time that it's going to take them 4 months to convince the king of Babylon, who they've made friends with, to actually let them leave. And that comes true. Another example from their time in Babylon, Apollonius and Damas are discussing whether or not eunuchs can actually be fully chaste, like whether they're chaste in their own minds or if they're just physically prevented from acting on their passions. So they're debating this, going back and forth. And Apollonius says to Damas, actually tomorrow you will see that even a eunuch can fall in love. And sure enough, the next day they're having an audience with the king, and there's some commotion elsewhere in the palace because a eunuch has been found with one of the women in the palace. So that's another prediction that he makes that comes true. Stuff like this comes up all the time in the text. He foresees that a plague is going to come upon the city of Ephesus, but the people of Ephesus won't listen to him, so instead of sticking around to find out what happens, he just skips town. And eventually the plague does come, and they beg him to come back and help them deal with it. There's also a time when Apollonius foresees a shipwreck, and he's like, we shouldn't get on that boat, we should get on the next boat. And then the report comes back that that boat was lost at sea. This kind of stuff comes up all over the place in the text. And I'm not talking about dream interpretation, which is not exactly a separate issue, but the reason I'm not bringing it up, even though Apollonius has dreams and he correctly interprets them, is because that's not necessarily that unusual. Anybody could receive a prophetic dream, and the interpretation really is where you would need to seek professional help. But Apollonius is already his own prophet, so he can just answer his own dream questions. There's also healing, although most of the healing that Apollonius does is really just pointing out to people that they're living wrong, and then they correct their ways, and they are healed of whatever ails them. So he tells a drunk guy not to be drunk anymore, and the guy stops drinking and fixes his life. He tells someone who's overweight to lose weight. Yeah, I'm not kidding, that's in the text. So that's a lot of the healing that he does. He does see the sages perform healing miracles. So when he's with them, people, petition them with their problems and they grant favor and they heal them. They heal blindness, lameness, issues with childbirth. They even rescue someone from paralyzation. And it's clear that Apollonius picks up on at least some of this. We don't get a lot of it in the text because, again, Apollonius is not a wizard, and he doesn't do wizard stuff. But there is that one time that Apollonius brought a girl back from the dead. One thing that goes along with prophetic abilities is the ability not just to see the future, but to see things as they truly are, so to speak. And Apollonius does this by identifying a number of monsters or demons, evil spirits, which are disguised as other things. And once he's identified them, he can then drive them out and, save the day. And it's not always the case that these beings are evil. There's one instance where Apollonius correctly identifies that this lion that is walking around the town randomly, that is randomly tame and friendly, that this lion actually is the trapped soul of a king. He points this out and advises that the people send this friendly lion to a sanctuary to be taken care of because it's actually a human king. So there's stuff like that, but a lot of times what he identifies is evil spirits and he drives them out. So he's a couple episodes with this one kind of creature. I'm going to use the term empusa. There's a few different terms in the text that are used to describe this creature, including vampire. But these are not your Count Chocula vampires. These are invariably female demons who prey upon men by seducing them and then feeding on their flesh and blood. So in one episode, an empusa just kind of shows up, and Apollonius immediately knows what it is and is able to drive it out because he knows that the way to get rid of these things is to just shout really mean and insulting things to it. So that's what he does, and the creature goes away. And then in another episode, his follower Menippus, who Philostratus tells us Menippus was 25 years old and very handsome. So he falls prey to one of these seductresses, and so Apollonius has to tell him, no, don't go meet that girl later. She's actually a demon, and she's trying to feast on your flesh and blood. So he's able to save Menippus from that terrible fate. So that's the empusa. Apollonius also drives out another demon when he does go back to Ephesus to help them deal with the plague, and he realizes and points out to the people of Ephesus, hey, that beggar over there is actually a demon in disguise, and if you stone this figure, the demon will move away from the city and the plague will be resolved. And that is what happens. So Apollonius engages in prophecy. He can heal people both through mundane and magical means. He's not a wizard, but he did bring that girl back from the dead. He can also perform exorcisms. And then there's just other kind of unusual details that Philostratus does not go into in depth at all, but that are really interesting and contribute to this mysterious nature of Apollonius. One example that I love is when Apollonius is leaving to go and see the sages, he has to leave the palace of Fotes, and Fotes sends him with all of these parting gifts and supplies, including a bunch of stones. And Philostratus says, yeah, Apollonius was really excited to see one of these stones, although nobody knew why. And he just leaves it at that. And there's also this really great part, again, the plague of Ephesus, when Apollonius tells them the plague is going to happen, and then he leaves because they won't take his advice, and then they beg him to come back. Philostratus goes out of his way to say, now, Apollonius didn't actually go back to Ephesus. He just did that thing, how Pythagoras used to be able to do that thing, where he was in two places at once. Yeah, Apollonius did that. Anyway, and then he identified that the beggar was actually a demon and the plague was over. Everybody clapped. Philostratus does not elaborate or explain how or why or what that even looked like. Was he a hologram? Did he clone himself? Is he an apparition? Don't know. Don't care. There's so many details like this. Apollonius' arrest warrant, all the letters disappear and it's just a blank page. There's so many things that make Apollonius unusual and that make him memorable for us. Even if Philostratus wants to emphasize that he was not a wizard, people certainly thought he was. As I wrap up this video, I want to point out what I think are Philostratus's main points that he tries to get across in this life of Apollonius of Tyana. And the first is just that Apollonius is better than everyone else. I say this kind of sarcastically, but it really is true. Philostratus compares Apollonius to other philosophers, even including Pythagoras himself, who's supposed to be Apollonius's kind of North Star for how he wants to be, what he wants his philosophy to look like. Philostratus says that Apollonius behaved more divinely than Pythagoras. He is more chaste than Pythagoras or than Socrates. A young Apollonius recognized that his teacher Euxenus was not a true practitioner of Pythagoreanism, but was just repeating the teachings as he had learned them. He was 16 when he made this assessment of his teacher. Even though he was friendly with his teacher and wanted to do right by him in the end, he ultimately chose to leave because he recognized, even at that young age, that what this guy was selling wasn't up to the caliber that Apollonius was looking for. So that is one of the main themes that comes up over and over and over again. But another one is that Apollonius is willing to learn from others if they have really good things to teach him. So Apollonius learns the language of animals from the Arabs. He learns from the Magi. He learns from Fotes. He gets a sense of what India is like, and he learns how the Indians practice and what they value. He takes all of that information in. So while Apollonius is just better than everyone else, he's also constantly looking to improve himself through learning from others who he deems to be as wise or wiser than himself. And this is a philosophical quality that goes all the way back to Plato and Socrates. Socrates in his Apology says, right? The only way to really judge whether a person is wise is to figure out, how much they think that they know. Socrates says, "It turns out I am the wisest person because I'm the only one that knows that I know nothing at all." Apollonius embodies this. Yes, he goes around correcting people that are worse than him, but he's always on the lookout for people that are better than him, willing to travel across the world to what in the ancient mind was the end of the earth, just to learn from people. And then maybe the most significant takeaway that I've said already a bunch of times, but I'm going to keep saying, philosophy, according to Philostratus, is the best way of life. Philostratus is not the only philosopher to think this and write this. Nevertheless, it is here. Over the course of the life, we see how the study and practice of philosophy shape Apollonius's life, and they affect him socially. Apollonius benefits from philosophy quite a bit. His reputation precedes him. He's very famous. So anywhere he goes, he's getting recognized. And in fact, some places he goes, and he's treated very poorly until people realize who he is, and then he's treated very well. He's given lots of help along the way, including certified travel documents from one king to the next kingdom, and to ensure safe passage, not to mention all the food and hospitality that he's given everywhere he goes. And not to mention that he's allowed to live at various temples throughout his life, so he doesn't have to worry about getting a hotel anywhere. He gets access to the upper echelons of society, to kings and princes and priests and sages. And a lot of times he's put in an advisory role. Kings and priests and sages are asking him advice. They are asking him for help on matters of state. And this is really where Apollonius wants to be. People are begging him to come to their town to help them live better. He also gets to totally own people with facts and logic all the time. There's so many instances of Apollonius just humiliating someone for being, take your pick, publicly drunk, a menace to society, just kind of a jerk. And this is not limited to everyday citizens. He actually does this with kings as well, kings that are not as philosophically minded as his friend Fotes. Beyond that, philosophy gives him access to truth and understanding, which leads to true happiness. Apollonius is always content. He takes things with a grain of salt. He has a sense of humor. He is able to navigate difficult situations with optimism and clear-headedness. So it really benefits his life in all of these different ways. And of course, he has these special abilities that not everybody has. One of Philostratus's main arguments is that Apollonius is not a wizard. He just has these powers because of his dedication to his craft, which is philosophy. In other words, anyone can become exceptional by walking this path. This attitude about philosophy has implications for the way that philosophers are treated by the various kings and emperors that show up in the story, and we're going to spend more time on this question next time. The life of Apollonius of Tyana is truly a work of its day. I've treated it mostly in isolation just because it would take longer than the time that we have today to discuss all of the scholarship on this topic, other philosophical, historical, biographical writings, especially those that were written by Philostratus's contemporaries, and other wonder workers of the ancient world, Pythagoras being probably the most crucial comparison, Jesus Christ being the most compelling. But while a full and complete understanding of Apollonius's role in the history of philosophy, of mysticism, and of empire would require us to take in all of these other things, the story itself is so dense and so rich that you're going to have your hands full just chewing on the text for a little while. Speaking of chewing on the text, I highly recommend that you read this text on your own. I've put a link, as I said, in the description to a website where you can read it. It is long, it's a full book length, about 300 pages. But if you want to learn about Apollonius of Tyana, you just have to read it. Next time, I'm going to walk through the text in detail, book by book. There's 8 books. We'll take a look at some of the major points that I talked about today in much more detail. We'll look at how Apollonius is shaped by some of the places that he visits. We'll get into the philosophical discussions, actually talk about the philosophy, what it is, what some of his opinions are, and especially we'll get into how he comes into contact and eventually conflict with the Roman imperial system. And we'll spoil the ending next time. I didn't spoil the very ending today, but we will cover that next time. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you found this video helpful. I hope it's useful somehow. If you liked this video, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up. And as always, I'd love to hear your comments. Have you read this work before? Have you read Philostratus's Life of Apollonius? So we'll be back next time with more Apollonius of Tyana. If you don't want to miss that, feel free to subscribe to the channel. And that's it. I will see you in the next video.